So McMurria is interested in corporate connections to particularly extreme makeover home edition, but in general to reality TV and particularly Good Samaritan TV. So Extreme Makeover Home Edition appeared on ABC, which happens to be owned by Disney. Disney owned many things, but in the 90s invested in buying ABC. McMurray is also interested in the role that Sears plays on this show relative to home improvement products and just the general marketing of the things that they sell. So that's the current Sears logo. This certainly was the Sears logo I grew up with, and this is probably the Sears logo you grew up with. I'm always amazed that Sears is still in business. Every time I've gone into a Sears, it hasn't looked like they're doing well, but they still are a store and they still are selling stuff. In terms of extreme makeover home edition and race, what McMurria points out is that in the 2000s, government promoted what McMurria calls ownership society. Um, the neoliberal racial politics of this period in part focused on home ownership, the value of owning something yourself. Um, the show built homes for people of color in more than 1/3 of the episodes for the first 3 seasons, but never really addressed racial discrimination as a basis for economic insecurities. So again, in that sort of neoliberal philosophy, the structural inequalities that are part of the system, for lack of a better term, are very rarely or almost never addressed. In terms of reality TV, we know the history of reality TV, but McMurray goes through it as well. Began in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The goal was to cut programming costs by producing these somewhat low budget reality shows. Audiences had fragmented. There were a lot more cable stations, so there was a need to cut costs and get more eyeballs on the shows that networks were putting out. There were many cable channels growing almost exponentially. Scripting programming became more expensive in terms of talent and sets and paying actors and paying agents. So the idea was reality TV could be a cheaper version of television. Advertisers could embed product placements in reality shows, and it's not as though they couldn't embed product placements in non-reality shows and fictional shows, but it seemed more seamless to embed them in reality shows, much in the same way we saw them embedded into game shows. There was less sort of skepticism about why those products were there. As people skipped commercials, advertisers had to find new ways to get their products featured on shows. The advent of DVRs allowed people to just largely skip commercials entirely. There were also opportunities for additional revenue through merchandising, through interactive online formats where people could interact with these shows, and in doing so could generate additional revenue for advertising. In terms of the idea of home ownership, makeover themes on these shows connected the ideal of home ownership to making the space your own. So sometimes they were renovating old houses, sometimes they were renovating their current houses on some of these shows, but the focus was largely on home ownership. So one of the first shows was something called This Old House. Now it's interesting whether we would call This Old House a reality show. It didn't really feature real people per se, except for Bob Vila. Though sometimes they went to people's houses, real people's houses, to provide advice. So in some way, This Old House is very much in the reality vein. It was rebooted again as This Old House more recently. Bob Vila had another show called Home Again. Then the shows you may be more familiar with, Flip or Flop, is a reality television show. Property Brothers, another reality television show focused on on homes. And then, of course, the Vanilla Ice project, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where Vanilla Ice is flipping houses. Who knew that that was where his career would end up? In terms of the show Trading Spaces, um, Trading Spaces was based on a British show called Changing Rooms, which I wonder if they gave it this sort of very different title because in the US, changing rooms usually means like where you go to like change a baby's diaper. Trading Spaces was a trademark TLC show. It did get a little overexposed. There was just a little too much of it, and it saw particular ratings drop and ended up getting rebooted in a different sort of form. After 9/11, people traveled less and put more money and time into redecorating. So that was part of the appeal of these shows. And some, according to McMurria, some of these do-it-yourself home improvement shows were targeted at women. So the clip that we're going to watch will give you a sense of Trading Spaces, and will also give you a sense that Trading Spaces' real appeal was on the disasters, the really bad renovations, as opposed to ones that went super well.